Imagine justice held in a captain's cabin. No jury box, a judge in naval blue, and laws forged by men who called a woman sailor against nature. That math leaves almost no survival line. The Thames climbs, the noose is cut for a slow death. The mob wants spectacle, not truth. In that gaze, she's not a defendant, but a system glitch. Stand beside her on the dock, taste the damp rope in the air, and decide, was there ever a real choice here, or was the ending set long before testimony began? Start with the trial, because that's where the trap pretends to be a doorway. British Admiralty courts in the 17th and 18th centuries didn't look like cozy wood-paneled dramas with sympathetic juries. Most sessions were makeshift tribunals thrown together in ports like Spanish Town, Jamaica, New Providence in the Bahamas, Port Royal before it sank, or even aboard warships riding at anchor. No juries. Swift procedure. A naval judge advocate, a handful of officers, a clerk scratching furiously, and Marines at the door. The rules said piracy was a capital crime. The tone of the room said you were already dead. Witnesses were ship captains, naval lieutenants, and terrified sailors who would say anything to avoid being accused themselves. Defense counsel? Rare. Time to prepare? Laughable. And if you were a woman, every stare in the room added a silent charge, not only a pirate, but a gender traitor. The law had teeth and didn't hide them. The 1698 Piracy Act under William III made it simple. Those convicted shall suffer pains of death, with Admiralty handling the business wherever the Crown's writ ran. Wherever mattered. Out on the colonial edges, the bench and the gallows often traveled together. You could be captured off Hispaniola this week and tried in Jamaica the next with the ink still wet on the charge sheet. The proceedings were technically lawful, but the outcome was usually preloaded. The paperwork worked like a gun. The indictment was the trigger, the testimony, the powder, the sentence, the shot. Now, line up the names you know to see how narrow the escape hatch really was. Anne Bonny and Mary Read stood before a Jamaican court in 1720, accused alongside Calico Jack Rackham's crew. The court transcript is still quoted for a reason. When Rackham was condemned, Anne snapped that if he'd fought like a man, he wouldn't hang like a dog. That's not bravado, that's rage at a system that never gave them a fair day. Their defense was the only one the law let them try with a straight face, pleading the belly. A jury of matrons, yes, that was a thing, would examine the prisoner to confirm pregnancy. If the verdict was positive, the court would stay the execution until after birth. It wasn't mercy, it was logistics. Lives still got cashed out later. Mary Read died in prison of fever, not freedom. Anne Bonny vanishes into the fog of contradictory records. Some say release, some say a quiet life under a different name. What's undeniable is that I'm pregnant was one of the only levers a woman could pull in a courtroom built to ignore her. And for most women, even that lever didn't exist. Take Mary Critchett. In 1729, she was captured with a gang of escaped convicts who turned to piracy near the Virginia Capes. The colonial court at Williamsburg didn't blink. Guilty. No delay. No spectacle beyond the necessary. Rope, judgment, done. Her name doesn't fill songs. It fills a line in a record book and the space under a noose. If a verdict didn't end you immediately, the system had other ways to break you first. Flogging wasn't a rumor, it was a tool. The cat o' nine tails wasn't just cord. It was 9 tongues of leather with knots or metal tips designed to shred. A dozen lashes meant meat torn open. 50 meant scars you'd feel in every storm. 100 could kill. Crowds were invited. Women and children watched, because the punishment wasn't just pain, it was a public message. Look, the state said, this is what happens when the low-born steal ships and when women forget their place. For men, flogging broke backs and pride. For women, it also stripped dignity in ways meant to linger. Clothing shredded, flesh opened, the body turned into a lesson. Colonial governors liked their lessons loud. Don't think the whip was the only pressure. Starvation in the jail, filth in the cell, fear as a daily ration, these were quiet punishments that never made broadsides but did their job. Prison in colonial ports was often a dungeon under a courthouse or an airless room at the end of a passage that smelled like mold and piss. Food was whatever the gaoler felt like allowing. Water was water if you didn't look too closely. If you wanted to talk about rights, the turnkey would laugh and rattle the keys like a punchline. And then there was the gallows, because the state loved a performance. Execution Dock at Wapping was the Empire's theater of cruelty. The condemned were hauled in a slow procession from Newgate Prison across London, jeered and pelted, paraded like trophies behind soldiers with fixed bayonets. At the river, the gallows waited just above the waterline. Admiralty insisted on a short drop, not the long drop that snaps the neck and speeds death. The short drop strangles. The body kicks and writhes as the noose throttles, a spectacle sailors called the Marshal's Dance. Pirates hanged there were left until 3 tides washed their legs, a ritual meant to marry them to the element they had abused. Men suffered it by the dozens. Women, fewer in number, suffered it with the same finality. The message spared no one. The sea gave you freedom. The sea will watch you die. Sometimes the law went further, turning corpses into billboards. The worst offenders were gibbeted, caged, and hung near harbors or river bends as warnings that creaked in the wind. You don't often hear of women gibbeted. Their bodies were rarer, and their deaths already served propaganda needs. But the threat mattered. It told every woman watching from a skiff or a quay that the ocean did not belong to her, and that stepping onto its stage without permission would end at a hook. Now ask the ugly question with me, what if the rope doesn't come? Was that mercy? Not always. In the Spanish Main and Portuguese Atlantic, the line between pirate, privateer, and prisoner blurred. Women aboard captured ships, especially black women, indigenous women, and poor European women, were routinely absorbed into systems that didn't care who they'd been yesterday. Colonial officials called them spoils, and the word did the work of erasing autonomy. Some became concubines in households where consent was a joke told behind closed doors. Some were sold into field gangs or domestic service and disappeared into plantation ledgers as nameless entries behind a column of numbers. Records rarely bothered to specify female pirate versus female aboard a pirate ship, and that ambiguity helped everyone who wanted to look away. The punishment there wasn't a sentence. It was a life stolen and renamed. Even within English jurisdictions, not every cell had a window. When land prisons overflowed, decommissioned ships became floating cages. Prison hulks appeared in harbors like Portsmouth and Plymouth. Colonial waters knew their own versions off Kingston or Port Royal. Strip the masts, bolt iron to the deck, shove bodies below. Air turned sour. Typhus and dysentery ran like fire. Guards used hunger as a lever and darkness as a gag. If you were a woman trapped in that hold, your danger multiplied. You were vulnerable to disease and to predation from men who held keys and ration tickets. Could you complain? To whom? Paperwork rarely recorded the abuse of women. Silence was part of the system. People died on those hulks, slowly, invisibly, and officially. No crowd, no speech, just absence that no one listed on a public notice. Let's not pretend every woman at sea fired a pistol and swung a cutlass by moonlight. Some were passengers. Some were captives, rescued or not, from merchantmen. Some were traders or smugglers caught in nets thrown wide. But the Admiralty's gaze wasn't gentle, and once that gaze labeled you pirate, nuance went overboard. Gender complicated everything. A man in breeches on deck was normal. A woman in breeches terrified lawmakers because it defied the scaffolding of their world. That's why Anne Bonny and Mary Read wore men's clothes on deck, not as a costume, but as armor against a universe that wrote rules to erase them. And when those rules cornered them on land, the boys' clothes became Exhibit A for unnaturalness. To be clear, pirates did terrible things. They robbed, they killed, They forced choices on people who deserved better. But the courts weren't controlling for fairness. They were managing narratives. The empire wanted trade lanes calm, insurance rates low, and colonial governors in control. A female body at the center of a piracy case was an opportunity to shout two messages at once: don't steal the crown shipping, and don't redraw the map of gender. The whip and the rope said both fluently. Walk with me into a trial room and listen to the mechanics so you hear the bias hum. The clerk reads names. The charges list feloniously and piratically, a phrase that tastes like iron. Witnesses swear oaths with the confidence of men who know the judge nods along. The accused stands in irons, hair hacked, short in jail, stomach a knot, eyes searching for a face that isn't hostile. Questions pin her to details that prove nothing except her presence on a deck. Was there a black flag? Did the ship bear guns? Did she carry a pistol? Did she go by a man's name? Did she stand watch? The law doesn't need her to have fired a shot. Presence plus intent equals piracy. And intent is easy to write in when the room wants it. If she speaks, she risks anger. If she stays silent, she invites assumption. If she admits to pregnancy, she gambles on a temporary stay and the mercy of matrons who might be hostile. If she names names, she becomes a witness, used and discarded. The court is a funnel. Everything runs toward the same narrow exit. At the end, the judge puts on the black cap of death, and the sentence rolls out in the ritual language of the age. Taken to the place from whence you came, and from thence to the place of execution, there to be hanged by the neck until you are dead. It's theater, but the trapdoor is real. Even when there is no trapdoor and only a stool that gets kicked. Now pause and answer this in the comments if you dare. If you were in that room and your life depended on 3 words, what would you say? Would you plead the belly? Would you accuse your crew? Would you spit like Anne? Or would you swallow the story the empire wrote for you and hope the rope is merciful? Let's follow one timeline to its bitter end so no one can pretend this is abstract. The cart leaves Newgate. The condemned sits facing the crowd, hands bound, gagged only by the mass of onlookers' noise. She passes taverns where men toast her death with ale bought with coins made safe by the very terror she's feeding. At Wapping, the marshals tie the knot, and it's deliberately placed to lengthen pain. A prayer mumbles. A hand pulls the support away. The body dances. There is no instant release, only a long argument with air that she loses. The tide kisses her boots. The second tide slap, slap, slaps. The third tide rises like a judge and closes the case. But maybe the court chose another path. Maybe she wasn't hanged. Maybe a Spanish colonial official assigned her to a household where her labor and body are taken without pay or consent. There is no headline, no printed confession, no sermon. There is only routine, laundry, cooking, abuse, pregnancy, work, disease. She becomes a statistic in a ledger somebody's grandson can't read. Or maybe she's shoved onto a prison ship where she coughs herself thin, hair falling out in clumps, skin gray in the lantern light, eyes adjusting to darkness as if light were a sin. On deck, the guards smoke and joke about tides. Below deck history performs an erasure with perfect efficiency. That's what systems do when they don't want martyrs. They make people disappear sideways. Does anyone fight back inside this machine? Sometimes. There are jailbreaks, bribes, exchanged uniforms, sympathetic clerks who misplace papers, sailors willing to say she was forced because they can sleep better at night. There are governors who commute sentences when politics demands showy mercy. There are matrons who find a quickened child because they want to believe there's time to reconsider. There are also mobs who demand blood louder than any sermon, and judges who dream of promotion and sign death with a neat hand. Don't expect a happy ending. Expect a human one. Complicated. Compromised. Gritty. Why should you care, here in your safe chair? Because who gets remembered is power. Because if you only know the names the Empire kept, you will never hear the full warning. The story of female pirates isn't a footnote. It's a test of the system's honesty. And the system failed. It punished piracy, yes, but it also punished gender nonconformity, poverty, and race. It stamped out threats to trade and threats to patriarchy with the same rope. It pretended to be blind and then stared at women until they burned. So here's your mirror. If you lived in that age and saw a woman in breeches take the helm in a squall, would you cheer or would you reach for a law book? If you read a broadsheet that called her a monster, would you nod along? If she stood in chains and asked you for one witness who'd tell the truth, would you speak? The past can't hear your answer. But you can, and you can drag it forward. We're at the end of the dock now, and the river looks the same as it did 300 years ago. Water doesn't remember names. Paper burns. The only reason Anne and Mary survive in our mouths is because a clerk bothered to copy their words, and because gossip outlived the people who told it. The rest, the nameless women flogged on hot piers, the ones sold to houses with barred windows, the ones who died in holds that smelled like rust and despair, those stories were erased on purpose. That is the final punishment, not death, but deletion. If this shook you, do something with it. Tell someone the next time a movie turns pirates into cute rebels and courts into fair games. Ask out loud whose stories got buried to keep trade moving and who benefits when justice wears a naval coat, and then talk back to the silence with whatever last line you'd want carved into a plank where the river can't reach. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment. Would you have pleaded the belly, kept your silence, or thrown the truth like a knife and taken the consequences? What part of this hit you hardest? The courtroom with no jury, the whip, the rope, the hulks, or the quiet vanishing? Your voice is the one thing those courts couldn't control. Use it. If you want more unfiltered history told without the sugarcoat, tap subscribe and share this with someone who still thinks the noose was fair. This is Flow of History, where we cut through the myth, name the forgotten, and make the past answer for itself.